True Grit, Prospecting Through Inherited Data, presented by Nate Beyerink and Kyle Constant from University of Central Missouri. Nate Beyerink is the Assessment and Acquisitions Librarian at the University of Central Missouri's James C. Kirkpatrick Library. He graduated in 2018 with his MLS from Emporia State University and has served in both public and academic libraries in the state of Missouri. Kyle Constant is the Library Systems and Discovery Coordinator at the University of Central Missouri's James C. Kirkpatrick Library. He worked in public libraries in management, technical, and administrative roles for 13 years before assuming his latest position in academia. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and you two can take over when.
Okay, good morning. Thank you for attending our session, True Grit, Prospecting Through Inherited Data. My name is Nate Beyerink, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Kyle Constant. As I mentioned, we're both librarians at the University of Central Missouri's James C. Kirkpatrick Library, and we're really excited to be here today to talk a little bit about our data-driven roles and how they were impacted by a number of circumstantial and institutional barriers that really made it a little bit more difficult for us to get started in our roles and get to the heart of our work. I think it's important to say that, no one can really ever expect that the information or records that we get from our predecessors are going to be 100% neat and ready to work with. But we believe that there are a few things that we can do that can make this a little bit easier on ourselves and easier on the next person to step into our role. To get started, though, we do want to kind of set the stage and give you a sense for the timeline that kind of led to us joining the library and some of the things that might have impacted the quality of the records that we received. So Kyle joined the library, JCKL, in the summer of 2021, and I joined just about a year later in the summer of 2022. But in the years immediately prior to us joining the library, there were, like I said, a number of events that kind of shook things up and made life a little bit more difficult for our colleagues. First, those being that the institution was going through a process of retrenchment. There was some staffing changes, some leadership changes, all of that applying a number of pressures to the team. Then towards the summer of 2019, towards the end of that, the library had finished their migration from the III Sierra ILS over to Ex Libris's Alma ILS, which of course upended a number of the procedures and processes that they went through. And we're still kind of feeling the aftershocks of that to this day, still working through some of those changes. And then lastly, of course, we have COVID-19 and everything that came with it. That really, again, upended the work that everyone did. It required everyone to be a lot more flexible and adaptable. So with all of those things in mind, I think it's really safe to say that our colleagues at the library during this time had their hands pretty full and were kind of, might have been more interested in maintaining operations and keeping things afloat, and maybe wouldn't have had as much time to focus and apply the energy to keep careful records and update documentation in a timely manner, and all those things that would be necessary to really pass off a good amount of information to whoever was going to be following them in those roles.
Right. So hopefully everybody can hear me okay. One of the big things that we want to talk about is just some best practices for data inheritance, and it'll kind of run into a little bit of succession planning. Like Nate said, we're still relatively new to our institution, and to say that they were going through a lot of changes is definitely an understatement. So the first thing that I want to talk about is really making planning a part of your culture. For those of you who have spent any time in management or administration, you'll probably know the colloquialism that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And while I have experienced that as a former administrator, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing that you can do to affect the culture of your institution. It also doesn't mean that you kind of have to just throw your hands up and accept the culture that exists. There are things that you can do and that we have done to improve the day-to-day practices. So documentation and data inheritance that we're talking about today really are all about and depend heavily on preparation, but preparation is not automatic. Next slide, please. So when you are going through your day-to-day work of dealing with whatever the issue may be, it's very tempting to kind of isolate. A problem arises, you try your best to find the appropriate solution, you implement the solution, and you're done. And there's not a lot of thought for what came before, what's going to come after. It's sort of putting out fires, so to speak. And the issue, obviously, that arises in those circumstances is that you don't have that planning piece. It's not an accident that the find solution portion of this visualization is the largest portion. That is what you will spend most of your time doing if you do not emphasize planning and you do not emphasize it as a daily or routine part of your duties. But again, as I mentioned before, that doesn't happen automatically. You have to intentionally integrate this as a part of your staff and your own behavior. So how do you do that? Next slide, please. This is a very simple example of one way that you can break up a given period of time. It doesn't have to be an annual process, but in this example, in this screenshot, it is an annual review process. This tool can be as simple or as complex as you need it. The point is not necessarily to focus on the tool itself. The point is to focus on the process. A lot of the emphasis and a lot of the effort that should go into creating a planning culture is about repetition. And so having a plan to plan is sort of necessary. You have to have a concerted effort to routinely come back and review the things that you've done previously so that it's not forgotten, so that it doesn't get pushed off because, again, because of that putting out fires mentality. If you don't have something like this that sort of guides you, or if you're a supervisor, the activities of your direct reports, something like this should definitely be created. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, these tools can be as simple or as complex as you need them to be. If you want to go more granular, or if you are, for instance, a supervisor over multiple units, you might need to go in and actually specify what period of time is going to be devoted to a specific piece of workflow or a piece of documentation, so that not only that the project itself is broken up into manageable pieces, but also that it's not something that's going to be easily forgotten. It's going to be something that, or that, to be frank, it's not always the most glamorous work to go back through all of this documentation. And so in some cases, it's not forgotten. It is left to the end of someone's workday because they would rather be focusing on another task. But again, the key is repetition. The key is constantly reminding people to focus on this and to prioritize documentation and data inheritance as a critical piece of their daily lives. And the initial process of going through things, going through your documentation, as it was for us, going through our documentation post migration to a new ILS, will likely be a more time-intensive process than it will be on repeat cycles. As you go back through, what you'll likely find is that most of the language and most of the steps are in place in your documentation, and smaller revisions need to take place. And those are key instances in which real institutional and organizational progress can take place, because you have your firm foundation of documentation. You have easy ways to solve a lot of your basic day-to-day problems because everything has been documented. And then you can really go on to further exploring additional services, additional functionality in different systems that you have. For us, the way that I really knew whenever I first came on to the staff here, the way that I really knew that this had become part of their culture was that in routine, seemingly undocumented documentation, related conversations, it was not uncommon at all for someone to say, make sure and put that in your documentation or document that. It was something that everyone was thinking about in a variety of workplace conversations. Next slide, please. So the hope would be that you would transition from the visualization that I showed at the beginning of a very isolated process of problems arising, finding solutions, and then implementing them and moving on, to a more cyclical process where, yes, you still have problems, and yes, you still have to find solutions, but you have authoritative and hopefully very thorough documentation that you can consult. Hopefully that finding solution portion of the process is going to be much abbreviated compared to what it was before. You implement it and then you document it. It's something that you have to fight frequently in these kinds of situations, is that feeling that we've added steps to our process. What you'll find is that, when visualized in this way, yes, there are 2 more steps, but each individual step takes much less of your time and takes much less effort or resources, because you have gone to the trouble of documenting things. And the more you document, the more you see the bigger picture, the more you see how things are interrelated and connected to one another. Next slide. So the next best practice that I want to talk a little bit about is version histories and archives. A common concern as you are reviewing documentation, reviewing workflows, and implementing new things is, and this is most common with folks who are in their position and are very comfortable in what they do. They've maybe been in their position for a long period of time, and they have a process that they really appreciate and that they really feel serves them well and serves the institution well. So the concern that ends up being raised is, we're going to lose institutional knowledge. We're going to lose practices that are already effective and that work. Why do we need to change something that isn't broken? One way to assuage those kinds of concerns is to maintain a version history and an archive for old documentation. A good way to think of this is a way to make sure that institutional knowledge is not lost, in that it is still in the archived versions of the old documentation, and it can free you up to do the things that you need to do now. As I mentioned before, review of this documentation should also be a routine thing. So your version histories should be reviewed on a routine basis, and should be a cyclical process as well. So something that a practical example I want to talk about involves file naming and putting comments into your data. So next slide, please. So this is an example of the file structure that I found when I started as a systems librarian a couple of years ago. This is all that I have access to for our Easy Proxy production server. This is not that uncommon. Some of you may be in a similar role or have similar responsibilities and have a similar experience, where I only have access to a blacklist file and a config file. And though those files are very, very powerful in terms of configuring Easy Proxy, I don't get to see the full file structure of our production server. I don't get to see how other files are configured and things like that. Of course, I can get into the admin console, but these files are just routinely copied over to our production server. And so as I came in and saw that this is the method by which our easy proxy had to be configured, it made me pretty leery about making large sweeping changes because one, I didn't want to break something that was already working, and two, if I did break something, it might take a while to get that update back up to the production server because I didn't have that kind of access. Next slide, please. So one thing that I started doing a lot more of was putting comments within the config file itself. This is just an example of a few IP ranges that were in our config file that were set up to either be excluded or automatically log in, but there wasn't a lot of information in the data about why these were set up the way that they are. They're commented in this example, but this is after I've gone through and figured out what each individual IP range is for and making those notations myself. So now, if anyone follows me, they have those notes so that they can easily interpret that data and know this is why these are set up the way that they are. You might also notice that these are commented out. This is, again, part of this routine review process that I talked about earlier. This was in the midst of a review process. I went through and did some testing. As I found what these were for, I commented them out to do some additional troubleshooting to see if it was really necessary to have these lines in our config file. And subsequent to this, it was found that they're not necessary and they have since been removed. But again, I have that version history. I have that archive so that I know what these lines were for. Next slide, please. Another example of making sure that you have notation in your data that will help the next person to assume these responsibilities is I also added a comment line to the top of the config file that says when I last updated it, as well as a parenthetical that shows the last stanza that I reviewed. In the box at the bottom, you can see the way that they are ordered on OCLC's Easy Proxy support page. And you can see that the date there is indicating the version of the Highwire Press stanza so that I know the next time, again, as a routine part of my daily work, I can come back in and start with that next stanza up, review those, make revisions that I need to, and then update the comment so that I know the next time I come in to make an edit that that I know where to pick up. Next slide. In addition, I also have created a config file archive. This is just on my local machine, but I have ready access now to previous versions of the config file so that should something go wrong, I do have something that I can go back to that I know was working at that time. So obviously, the naming convention is pretty easy to parse there just at a glance. Of course, that's by design. I've simply added the date that I updated the config file to the end of the file name. You can also see between May 17th and May 18th of last year, I also added a parenthetical to the file name that indicates the change that was made. Again, this is just to provide that at a glance reference point so that I know what was done. This naming convention is admittedly a bit unwieldy, but this is just present in the archive. It's not on the production server. The file is still just called config.txt there. So it's just an easy way to ensure that that I have files to fall back on. And it's also an easy way that I can very quickly go in on a routine basis and get rid of the oldest versions of these files so that data does not just pile up in that archive. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it back over to Nate, and he's going to talk a little bit about some visualizations.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. So in addition to some of the best practices that Kyle had mentioned, I wanted to talk specifically about the use of diagrams and other sorts of visualizations within your documentation or your records. While of course we're going to be using things like screenshots and stuff to capture the individual steps, I'm hoping to talk more about flowcharts and diagrams of that nature and using those to help communicate the work that's being done. And we found this to be the most useful working with our collection management unit. So of course, this unit is working with our acquisitions, cataloging, and pretty much any sort of ongoing management tasks with our collection. So as you can imagine, this group would really benefit from having a shared and consistent understanding of the work that's being done. And so as I joined the library, I was again tasked with looking through some of our documentation and making sure that it was as useful as possible. And some of the things that I found were that a lot of our individual staff members within our collection management unit had a really good understanding of their own tasks and their own roles, where that started and where that ended. But there really wasn't anything that documented the work from start to end. And so to help remedy that, I worked with our team, spoke to them, read through their documentation, and kind of drafted this initial flowchart that you see here. And we really wanted to use this as a tool to make sure that everyone, again, had that shared and consistent understanding of how things moved about in our collection management unit. So we met together, we gathered, and we looked at this, and we wanted to look for 3 specific things. First of all, do we all have, again, that shared understanding of where each person's task starts and ends? And so we kind of used these sort of swim lanes that you see here to kind of delineate all the tasks within these kind of subunits. So you'll see the red swim lane at the top for acquisitions, cataloging in the middle there is yellow, and then processing time at the bottom is green. And so that was an easy way for us to separate those out and clarify the roles. Secondly, we wanted to make sure that everything flowed. So we didn't want things going from our acquisition staff over to cataloging staff and then back and forth and back and forth. We wanted things to go smoothly, be handled once if possible, and then keep moving. So we made sure that as we were reviewing that all worked out. And then lastly, we wanted to be sure that any sort of step within this process that might cause a divergence was documented here as well. So these diamonds that you see throughout being our decision points that could potentially lead off in different directions. And I think once we got through that process, we were pretty happy with how we were able to communicate, a pretty lengthy process in a single page, essentially. And we have since used this, of course, with new staff who have joined recently, and it was very helpful to kind of give them the big picture view before getting into the narrow and more nuanced information. We've of course used this in addition to big picture stuff. We've also used this looking at more narrow specific tasks. We use this in preparing our more recent missing items procedure, and this was really beneficial so that we didn't have to write out a long lengthy document and wordsmith everything. We could easily look at it all on one page, move the pieces around, and talk about what worked and what didn't work, and along with our notes. And so again, this was really beneficial for us. And so if you're interested in using any sort of application to do similar sorts of diagrams, whether that be something like a flow chart, or if you need like an org chart or like a mind map kind of thing, there are tools out there to do that. Of course, Microsoft Office products have a lot of basic tools that one can use to do this. But if you're looking for something that's maybe a little bit more targeted towards those sorts of tasks, Microsoft also offers Microsoft Visio, which is a great option. But there are also some browser-based ones like Lucidchart and Draw.io, which are looking at the things that I made. These were both made in Lucidchart, but recently swapping more over to Draw.io since there are some freemium limitations on Lucidchart. And then last thing I want to talk about was the value of recording and capturing institutional knowledge. So oftentimes as we're drafting our procedures and documentation, we get a little caught up and we feel like we don't have time. Our vendors are out there. There's external documentation. Why are we doing this ourselves? Well, you can use that other stuff, but in the end, you're only going to have half the story. So for example, as I joined the library, I was working through updating a lot of our records, specifically for like our annual statistics. And of course, I can go to SpringShare's LibCal tool and download information about our room bookings, our study room bookings. That's only going to tell me, that year's. It's not going to tell me how I'm supposed to incorporate that with our previous year's data. It's not going to explain if there's been any naming convention changes, or even, if a room stops having booking data, what's going on there. Thankfully, in this case, I had a lot of help from our staff on hand that were able to help me kind of sort out some of those mysteries. But that's the value of our local data. That's the stuff we want to capture. So as you're going in drafting your sorts of documentations or other sort of records that are going to be beneficial for you and your staff, yes, you can include that vendor documentation, but understand that it's going to be more high level or surface level. It's going to talk about the whole breadth and options with that tool, while your local stuff is really going to be needing to capture a lot of those configurations, capture that context, and talk about how that tool is going to be used to serve your needs and your goals. And there are a number of ways that you can incorporate that vendor documentation. If you simply just want to include a link in like a helpful link section in your documents, that's a great way of doing that so that you don't have to link to specific things, or you can link to specific things, as you see we've done here. This has just been a way for us to kind of cite the information that was helpful for us in drafting this sort of documentation for this specific procedure.
Okay, I think actually, Nate, let's just skip the wrap-up slide. We've gone pretty long, so let's just go on to the questions. And if we don't get to everything, please, hopefully an organizer can send those to us, and we can try to respond as we can.
Yes, that's exactly what we'll do. And if anyone has any questions, just throw them in the Q&A, please. So we have a lot of what tool did you use to make this beautiful flow chart? I think you mentioned it, but if you want to mention it again, just in case someone missed it.
For sure. Let me go back there. So I, again, used Lucidchart with a lot of things. But as I mentioned, that does kind of have a freemium model. So I think there's you make like 5 visualizations. And then you have if you want more or want to share it, I think there is a small fee that you can pay to have the full access. But Draw.io, I think, is a fully free option that you can use that has a lot of the same features. And I am kind of shifting more towards using that.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have, unfortunately, but we'll forward any other outstanding questions in the chat to you both, and then we will share answers from this Q&A as well as all the other Q&As that we don't get to in today's sessions, along with the slides and recordings to all attendees. There'll be an email with links to everything, announcing that when it's all ready. So thank you both very much for your presentation. I agree that that is a beautiful flowchart that you created. Yeah, so thank you both very much.